Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a historical fiction themed episode of Door to Door. We are thrilled to have two amazing acclaimed historical fiction authors. First, we have Meg Waite Clayton, author of The Last Train to London. The paperback is on sale today, so you can get your own copy. Congrats on that, Meg. Woo! uh, so this is the heaps of praise on this novel is really something. So this is based on the true story of Truus Weissmuller, who was a Polish resistance fighter and in pre-World War II era, basically led the kinder transport rescue of 10,000 children from Nazi-occupied Europe. Starred reviews from Booklist and Library Journal. Booklist says enlightening, meticulously researched library journal with its well-developed characters and race against the clock plot. This fantastic novel should have broad appeal. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, Meg. I know you have a bunch of stuff to share with us, and I love these, based on true story novelized accounts. I think they just really add something rich to the story. So I can't wait to learn more from you. And then also we have our friend Elise Hooper, who again, critically acclaimed historical fiction author. Previous novels are The Other Alcott and Learning to See. And your latest novel, Fast Girls, which goes on sale July 7th, so not much of a wait, it's a novelized account of the true story of the female athletes and members of the first integrated women's Olympic team and their journeys to the 1936 Summer Games in Berlin, Nazi Germany. And again, heaps of praise from both historical fiction authors, best-selling authors, and in this case, Booklist, which gave it another starred review. Congrats, Elise, who says, Hooper celebrates 3 unheralded female athletes in a tale spanning 3 Olympiads for fans of historical fiction about real people and stories about little-known female heroes breaking through barriers. I think that says it nicely. Thank you again for joining us, Elise. So good to see you virtually after all this time. We saw you in Seattle, I think, last, so things are a little different now, but it's nice that we could all be together. So we're going to start with Meg, who's going to tell us about her book, and then we're going to have Elise on to round the program out. Before we start, though, is there anything we want to say before we dive into these stories?
I'm gonna give a little, when I start talking, I'm gonna give a little shout out to librarians because you guys have made me a writer. But I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation. But thank you all for being here. It's really lovely to have everybody here. And thanks to HarperCollins for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, I know, I miss libraries. I can't wait to go in one again sometime soon.
Mine today started curbside delivery, so curbside pickup. So that's our big excitement in Palo Alto where I am.
That is exciting.
Yeah, libraries have been very creative about how they can help their communities. So that's a really great topic. And again, Lisa, I think we saw you in Seattle for the ALA Midwinter Conference, so you're well aware of the community. Right. And again, feels like a lifetime ago. Wasn't that long ago, but. Again, so I think we'll get down to the story of these 2 incredible novels. So Elise, we're going to put you in the green room. So enjoy your virtual snacks and sodas and whatever else is back there. And we'll see you again very, very soon.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, Meg, we're going to give you the floor. If you could tell us about The Last Train to London.
Great. Wait, Lainey, are you going to do the screen share? Because I thought I was going to do it.
Oh, I was just going to show them the cover.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. Oh, well, I'm Meg Waite Clayton. I'm a novelist who's passionate about telling stories about remarkable women doing extraordinary things. And the novel I'm here to talk about today, The Last Train to London, is just that, a story about a truly remarkable woman who I have so privileged to come to know. So I'll start out by saying just a little bit about it, and then I'm going to share some slides here with you. But a decade ago, my usually chatty teenage son arrived home troublingly silent. He's a very cheery child, and so I thought somebody had broken his heart. But it turns out he'd just come home from interviewing someone who had been put on a Kindertransport rescue train from Vienna to England when she was 9 years old. I will tell you, I could not imagine being a parent putting a child on that train. I could not imagine being a child getting on that train, but thousands of people did. And it turns out I can't imagine it because that is the story of The Last Train to London. So I'm going to switch over now, if this goes well, to a screen share. And Lainey, if this doesn't go well, give me a shout out and let me know. So I'm going to go screen share. And then I'm going to go PowerPoint, share. And then I'm going to take this to slideshow. Okay, does that work? All right. Okay, so The Last Train to London is the story of Truus Weissmuller. I'll tell you, Oskar Schindler has all the fame, but here's a woman who faced down Adolf Eichmann to bring thousands of children to safety. It's a story of spunk, wit, and courage by a woman trying to hold on to her own childless marriage while rescuing other people's children. It's the story of two children in Vienna whose unlikely friendship saves them by bringing them into Truus's path. And it's the story of the difference one person can make, a story that could not be more relevant in today's world of closing borders and rising anti-Semitism. It's a World War II story, but one you haven't seen before. I'm going to say a little bit today about where the novel started, spoiler alert, not with Truus, and the real story behind it and how hard it was to uncover some of that. But I'm going to start with just a few seconds about how I started writing, because that has to do with you guys. So librarians, libraries. So this is me, circa 1970. I'm at the Sierra Madre Library. I'm 11, already in my second year of braces and about to go on that most horrible of journeys to buy my first brassiere. We just moved to Sierra Madre, into a neighborhood with no kids. And so I was left to the mercy of my 4 brothers and the company of books. Fortunately for me, my local library was having a summer reading contest. So what I did every morning was I took my bike down to the library and I traded in the books I'd gotten the day before and checked out more for more books. Of course, I wanted to win, so I chose short books. But then the librarians started putting better books into my hands, including that summer, A Wrinkle in Time and To Kill a Mockingbird. And in reading those 2 books, I began to imagine becoming a writer myself. So fast forward not quite 3 years, I'm in the 8th grade. I'm back in Chicago, where I mostly grew up. And my English teacher kept me after school to hand me back a poem and encouraged me to try to have it published. Well, I sent it out to the one place I knew published poetry, which is 17 magazine. Well, I'm sorry to say that they rejected it. It turns out 17 publishes mostly Pulitzer Prize winning poets and not poetry written in purple ink on lined paper by 14-year-old girls. I will tell you it was 20 years before I ever submitted anything again, but in case you think that encouragement did not mean the world to me, I want you to know that I still have this poem with my teacher's handwriting on it that I wrote almost a half a century ago. So thank you, librarians and teachers, for the way you inspire us. In case you ever doubt it, just call me and I will tell you, keep it up. So The Last Train to London is based on the true story of the Kindertransport rescue of 10,000 children from Nazi-occupied Europe and this one extraordinary woman, Truus Weissmuller. When I first heard about it from my son, I began to try to learn as much as I could about it, doing things like watching documentaries and reading books, and ultimately reading a whole bunch of oral histories of the real children who were rescued, usually taken when they were in their 70s and 80s and 90s. But I didn't think it was my story to tell because I'm not Jewish. So I'd learned early on in this process about a guy named Nicholas Winton who ran the Prague rescues. And so that gave me the idea that there must be somebody who led the Vienna rescues as well. And I went in search. I will tell you, it was truly years into my exploration of this topic before I found the name Truus Weissmuller. After I found her name, I could find out a little about her. She was recognized as righteous among the nations, which is an honor given to Gentiles who helped rescue Jews. And so that that little entry didn't even include the word Kindertransport, but it did tell me that Truce's big advantage was that she was a Gentile who had access to the Nazi power structure. So I'm not Jewish, but neither was Truce. It really opened up my eyes to the importance of everybody being involved in these kinds of stories and everybody caring about these kinds of stories and everybody reading these kinds of stories. And so, oddly, as daunting as Truce is, she was the way that I found my way into this story. Here's a little secret. I'm not Dutch either. And that did, while not daunting for me somehow, did pose some problems when it came to the research, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I started the story where it started for me, with the children and their parents. I set these two photos beside me as I created the characters of Sophie, Helen, and Stefan. Sophie is the math prodigy daughter of an anti-Nazi journalist and a Christian. And Stefan is the overprotected, overprivileged son of a wealthy Jewish chocolate family. They're teenagers. You might notice the photograph on the left, she is not a teenager. She is also the wrong religion, the wrong nationality, and even the wrong hair color. Nonetheless, this photograph, the love poured out of me when I first saw it, and that was the kind of love that I needed to turn into Sophie. So I don't suppose it'll be giving too much away to say that one of these two teenagers might become sweet on another one. I meant them only to be friends, but teenagers will be teenagers. Stefan's father, as I said, owns a chocolate business. And part of the reason I did that was because if I was writing about a chocolatier, it gave me the excuse to taste every bit of chocolate that came my way and call that work. So actually, the real reason I did that is because I wanted to show that the Jewish population of Vienna before the Anschluss was integrated into Vienna society and very prosperous, and a chocolate business was as tasty a way as I could figure out to do that. Before Hitler invaded Austria, more than half of Vienna's bankers, lawyers, and doctors were Jewish, and almost half its journalists. Hitler was just across the border, and anti-Semitism was on the rise. But here's the thing. At first, Hitler was seen as a joke. Even after he was made Chancellor of Germany, people thought it was a madness that would pass. And he was across the border. People were living their lives, sending children to school and baking bread and doing all those things we do, not imagining that this madness would enter their own lives. The change that occurred in Germany, which took years there, happened in literally months in Austria. When 1938 opened, Austria was a free country, its Nazis largely imprisoned. In March, Hitler invaded. In November, the Kristallnacht night of violence and burning synagogues. So that's how quickly it happened, from March to November. I will tell you that some portion of my book happens in this fairly amazing underground world that underruns Vienna, in which Sophie and Stefan run around. It's some natural, some man-made tunnels, some sewers. There's a 3-story underground area that used to be a convent. There's an area that used to be a Talmud school, and there's even a place that was an underground horse stable. There's a crypt. And not all the bones are in coffins, I'm sorry to say. So what better place for a teenager to try to kiss an infatuation than in the dark underground where scary guys like Orson Welles hang out. This is literally Orson Welles from a movie that was filmed in the Vienna underground just after the war ended. So it gave me a really great look at what that world looked like at that time. So, 1938, Vienna. Hitler crosses the border and takes Austria. People in Vienna realize they need to leave, but by then, of course, borders are changing, are closing all over the world to Jews. Sorry. I step into this world of children in peril, steps Truce Weissmuller. She's begun rescuing children from Nazi Germany by the time the novel opens, but in small numbers. The people organizing the Kindertransport hoped to rescue thousands. So I started looking for information about truce, but my research was finding almost nothing beyond that righteous entry. It was December 2016, so 8 years after I first learned about the Kindertransports, before I came upon a notice about the publication of a sort of biography of truce. But despite the notice being English, the book was published only in Dutch, was 50 years out of print, and was available for purchase nowhere in the world. There were a few copies, in libraries of course, in the US, but the closest one to me was 2,000 miles away. Fortunately for me, my son happened to be in a PhD program at one of the universities that had a copy. So I called him up and I said, Chris, could you just, walk down to your library, check out this book, photocopy it for me and send it to me. There was a pause on the line and I thought, well, of course, he's just started this intense PhD program. Maybe he doesn't want to spend an hour over a photocopier for his mom. But what he said was, hey mom, copyright laws, you're a lawyer. So I said, published only in Dutch, 50 years out of print, to which he said, he quoted back some words that I often said to him when he was growing up, which is, if you lose your integrity, you lose everything. So he found out what he could get me under copyright laws, and that was, he sent me the table of contents, which I Google translated, tried to guess which pages might be best, and he sent me those pages. Those pages were in Dutch, of course, which I don't speak or read. And actually they were in Dutch and German, which was a little bit of a Tetris problem for the amazing translation team of Google Translate and non-Dutch speaking yours truly. But with much effort, I put together a very bad translation of the pages he sent me, and they included a very short passage about one of the major obstacles that truce faced in helping get children out of Vienna. And that was the man in charge of Vienna at the time, who was a young and ambitious, not yet infamous Adolf Eichmann. Yes, that Adolf Eichmann, the one who several years later would devise the final solution. And truce faced him down. How about that? So, Toni Morrison once said that if there's a book that you want to read that hasn't been written, you must write it. When I found Truce, became a story that I absolutely had to read. And I'm just going to say that Toni Morrison has a Nobel and a Pulitzer, and so I take her advice. I enlisted a Dutch friend who helped me find a copy of Truce's book in a library in the Netherlands. And fortunately for me, the Netherlands copyright laws allow you to photocopy out of print books. So she photocopied it for me, sent it to me, and I translated it page by page, line by line, pulling out German, separately translating it, putting it all back together, the whole book. I'm humbled by the response to the novel, which will be published in a total of 19 languages. It was tipped by the most popular non-news TV show in the Netherlands, Truce's Own Country, which helped it become a bestseller there, as it already was in the US and Canada. But it was just really special to have her so completely forgotten before now, so much better known in her own country now. Here it was named a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and they recommend it for book clubs. But I'll tell you that by far the most moving responses I received on the novel, by far the most moving part of this for me, has been the responses I've gotten from real people who were rescued in the effort. This is Marion Wolf, who was number 211 on the first transport from Vienna. And she told me that the story was just like she remembered it. This is Erica Opper on the right. Her mother, Gertrude Ruth Friedman Opper, on the left, was on a 1938 Kindertransport from Vienna. She's pictured here with her granddaughter Naomi and her great-granddaughter Lucy. They are, as Erica told me, 4 generations who wouldn't exist were it not for the goodness of strangers. I should say here that we're putting together some book group pages. They're not quite done, but they're mostly done. And they include a number of things, including a timeline of the period and the story behind the story, and some other resources for reading, including an amazing poem that one of the survivors gave me to share, and also pictures of a number of the real survivors with just a little bit about them. So it's a really cool to be able to put that together. I would say the last person whose response I want to share is a man named Paul Alexander. He lives in Israel, and somebody here sent him a copy of the book. Paul was put on a transport when he was 1 year and 7 months old. He wrote me, "I have just finished reading it. Actually, I didn't read it. I cried all the way through. It touched my heart from beginning to end. Thank you, Meg, for writing this book, and I can confirm, as you hope in your dedication, that your book more than does my story justice." Honestly, if I'd imagined before I started writing this book that these real families would be reading this story, I don't think I would have been able to write it. But it's Truce's story, and that of the children and the families involved. But as I wrote it, I kept in my heart the silence of my own son that day that he came home and first told me about the kinder transports. I hope it does all their stories justice, and that Truce will inspire you as much as she inspires me. And I would love to answer any questions that you have. And I should say also, if I didn't say it already, that I'm more than happy to do library events for any library. Libraries have been so good for me, and I welcome every opportunity to return that.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
That was
Thank you, Meg.
amazing. I got kind of emotional. Those were some really high def photos too. You really, those were amazing.
Photos are so lovely, and people send me photos, and it's such a joy. One of the things I got to do was go to the, was invited to a Kinder Transport Hanukkah party this year, and it was a bunch of people. I went to Amsterdam last summer and met I think 8 Kinder Transport survivors, and they are, to a person, the people I've met, just really extraordinary and warm and wonderful. Many of them did not talk about their experiences until very late in their lives, and I've talked to a lot of children of the Kinder who said their parents never talked about it. So it's, I think, a healing process to have the story out there and be considered.
Yeah, I think, we all live in times where we think, what would we do, or what are we doing? And what was her support system, the people around her? What were their reactions when she started doing all of this stuff?
Well, she was a social worker, and so she was already surrounded by people doing stuff. She had a husband who, what I know about her largely comes from this book that I translated from Dutch, so it's a little iffy. But what comes out in there is that her husband was a very supportive person, and I think that was really important to her, and that she was in a whole group of people trying to help, and so it was part of what she did. Obviously, she did more than most people. I mean, she would literally go over the border into Germany and hide children under her skirts to bring them back to the to bring them to safety in the Netherlands. So, she is above and beyond, but there were a lot of extraordinary people involved in the story, many of whom I write about. Many of the characters in the story are real characters, including like Norman and Helen Bentwich, who were involved on the British side of the effort to get Parliament to approve the Kinder Transport to let the children into England.
And Meg, you touched on this a little bit in that a lot of the survivors, or the family of the survivors, they weren't that eager to talk about such a traumatic story, and I understand that. But I was shocked just looking up Truce online, how there's still almost nothing out there, at least in English, about her. So why do you think her story is so unknown up to this point?
It's really interesting. I'll say that, when I first started doing this, if I Googled her, I would have gotten about 5 hits. And now I can get maybe, I don't know, 15,000 or something, which seems like a lot until you go, if you Google Meg Waite Clayton, you get like 5 million hits. And let's just say she's way more interesting than I am. I think, one of the things that happened was that people were looking forward, not looking back, that many of the kids who were saved were very young and don't even remember having been saved. And people didn't mostly want to talk about it. She went on to do some great things, like she was on the city council of Amsterdam for a number of years. She was one of the founders of the Anne Frank House. She helped Otto Frank buy the house back from the people who owned it by then. So she did all these crazy, amazing things, but she wasn't somebody who tooted her own horn. And the kinder transports were not well known really until I think just before the turn of the century. Nicholas Winton's like a scrapbook that he'd kept of the children that he rescued surfaced, and he was still alive, and so there was a lot of publicity on that. And so basically, even though he came late to the party and saved far fewer people than Truce did, far fewer children than Truce did, to the extent there is a name tied to the kinder transport, it's his. But I'm glad she's getting better known. There was just a documentary about her in the Netherlands released in May, March or May. And the book's helping her become better known. I have connected with her great grandnephew, and he is very glad about her getting better known through it. So.
And speaking of connections, our friend Lisa Holstein with the Evansville Vanderburg Library in Indiana, or my home state, she wanted to know, as far as the children who were rescued, were many of them reunited with their parents, or were the majority of them unable to ever reconnect due to Nazi?
Yeah. Well, first of all, huge shout out to Lisa. Lisa and I have known each other since she was in Tucson, I think. We met years ago. And it's really nice to be connected in person. So the answer to that is most of the children did not reconnect with their parents. Most of their parents did not survive the war. To the extent that they did, they are not, some did. Some parents got out before the war began, and then those children were reunited sometimes with their parents, often in the United States. That's how a lot of the people who are here got here. But most did not. Most grew up with foster families in England or came to the United States where they were reunited with other family. Even when they were, it was often difficult. Often because they came to England so young, they learned to speak English. And then, by the time the war was over, this is 1938 when they came, by the time the war was over and people could reunite, you're talking 7, 8, 9 years later. Often the children no longer spoke German to parents who only spoke German. So that was complicated. One of the crazy, amazing things I got to do was for the Dutch launch of the book, HarperCollins in the Netherlands brought me out to Amsterdam and Belgium. And in Amsterdam, I got to be interviewed by the director of the Anne Frank House, which was really cool. But in Belgium, I got to be on stage with a man named Henri, who was rescued by Truce. He was rescued and taken to the Netherlands, and then sent to Belgium, where he still was when Belgium was invaded by Hitler, and so he spent the war years in hiding. And what that meant was that this woman took care of him for 7 years, brought him books from her local library. She checked out everything so nobody would know that she had this 7-year-old boy in her attic, basically. And so he read very broadly. But so then his mother came to find him after the war, and he had only known this other woman for all these years. And so he said he didn't want to go with his mother, and his mother made the really impossible choice to give up her son a second time so that he would be happy. So a lot of stories like that. And yet these people, these real survivors, as I meet them, they are to a person amazingly positive and optimistic. Many, hugely successful. There were out of this group of like 10,000 kids, there were 2 Nobel laureates. Really, people did extraordinary things. So they survived.
That's amazing. I can't, that probably illustrates what you're saying about not talking. There's a lot of emotions and history wrapped up into what they went through even after going through the original transport.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Meg, there's an outpouring of appreciation for the story, the photographs, and everything you've done with this novel. For those who've read it, those who are now planning on reading it, people are just fascinated and really in awe of this story, a necessary story. So thank you for sharing this and doing the research and giving voice to the story. It really does mean a lot. So we are going to bring Elise on now. And Meg, you're going to stick with us for the end, right? So we can
I am,
come back.
absolutely. I'm going to watch Elise
say
on my
goodbyes.
little side device. I'm looking forward to that.
Can't wait. Well, again, thank you so much, Meg. Again, we'll see you here at the end of the episode, but I'm going to go ahead and put you in the green room and see you in a few minutes. All right. Thanks so much, Meg.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And now we will, that was incredible. Like, seriously incredible. I'm shaking a little bit. I don't know how Meg got through that presentation.
Don't know how she got through that. Like I was,
Yeah.
That was special to see and hear her story.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
I think it's so cool about these. We have all of these photographs. It really is that's the best part of historical fiction. You can really connect to it. So I'm so glad we had those. And we have more photos coming from our next guest, who is Elise Hooper, coming back.
Bring her on.
I hope the green room was to her liking. That's her favorite joke. Hi.
Hi, Elise.
Oh,
Welcome back.
thank you. That was so amazing to hear. What a story. What an act to follow.
Yeah,
they're both.
I'm not worried about you, but that, yeah, I mean, and it's funny how these stories, you know, they kind of bump up against each other in a way. So it's, and I know there was some cross pollination between some of your books and some of Meg's as well. So maybe we'll get to that at the end. But do you want to tell us a little bit about Fast Girls?
Sure. Well, my book then, I guess, precedes this one just by a smidge, by Meg's. But it's funny, I feel like we have a lot in common when I was listening to her talk about this, partly because I think it's really neat that her kids played such a big role in the origins of our books. And, you know, people always ask me where my ideas come from. And, you know, sometimes it's a tough one to answer because, you know, these things just sort of miraculously kind of appear through this or through that. And the story of Fast Girls really does connect with my younger daughter, who is a swimmer. And she had a project to do for her library class in 4th grade. She had to do a biography project, and it had to be on an American who was no longer alive. And so she picked Gertrude Ederle, and I had honestly no idea who Gertrude Ederle was. Have either of you heard of her before? Okay. So she was the first woman to swim the English Channel. I should have included a picture of Trudy. Boy, she needs so much recognition. She was such a champ back in her day. She was a 1924 Olympian, won several medals, and it took her 2 tries, but she swam the English Channel. In fact, her time was so close to the couple of men who had preceded her. She came home feted, as President Wilson called her, America's best girl. She was the real deal, a really big deal. But none of us have heard of her. And I have played sports my whole life. I continue to play. I compete in tennis these days. Still, I play league USTA tennis. And I've always been a runner. I've run the Boston Marathon. I've done all these things. And yet I realized I had a real gap in my own knowledge about pioneering women athletes. So I started to dig around, and I found these stories of these 3 women, and I really couldn't believe I had never heard of them. And this was a couple of years ago. And so 2020 at that point seemed really different to us. It was going to have the Olympics in Japan. And so it just seemed like an amazing time to dig into these women's lives. And so I did. And again, libraries played a big part of this. I was in touch with so many librarians and archivists around the country to help me really piece together the lives of these 3 women who have really been overlooked by history. And the first, and Selena, I don't know if you want to, here we go. Our first is a picture of Betty Robinson. Betty was the first of these athletes, as I was researching, who I found. And she was this 16-year-old high schooler in Chicago, right outside of Chicago. She one day was running for the train, and her teacher spotted her, as I guess teachers, here I am, a former teacher. I've never gone this far above my duty, but I love that this teacher did this. He saw her running for the train. He thought she looked so fast. He suggested that they do a time trial the next day. And so he timed her, and lo and behold, she had this remarkable sprinting ability. So he said, well, let's do something with this. Let's enroll you in a race here in Illinois. And remarkably, Illinois had actually gone so far, I think it was in 1906, to ban girls from competing in athletic events, in running. And so, but the AAU at that point was sponsoring a few races, and Betty was able to get into one of these. And she had this remarkable performance where she came in second to this world record holder. And so 1928 were the Olympics in Amsterdam. And this is the first Olympics that women were invited to compete in track and field. Women started competing in the first of the modern Olympics in 1896, but really just a handful of women. And it was in what were called sort of aesthetically pleasing sports, golf, tennis, that is actually a term, aesthetically pleasing sports. And so track and field was really considered kind of blue collar and unappealing. I mean, who wanted to see a tired looking woman? So that was actually how they justified keeping women out of this for so long. And really the founder of the modern Olympics really felt women should just play a decorative role. He thought they really should just hand the laurels off to the men and sort of stand on the sidelines and applause. But fortunately for us, there were some tenacious women who challenged this. And so Betty was a lucky figure in the sense that she was kind of at the right time at the right place here in 1928, having had a few outstanding races. And because this was so at the beginning of things, she was invited to come try out for the Olympics. She had an amazing qualifying time. And within a few months of that first race at her first run at her high school, she was in Amsterdam as a 16-year-old at the Olympics. She was considered a real underdog. But Betty was a woman of surprises, and we'll see this throughout the book, but she, and this happens right in the first few pages, this isn't a big spoiler, she ends up exceeding everyone's expectations, and she wins a gold medal. And she comes home as this really big deal. She kind of saved America's skin during these 1928 Olympics when really most of the athletes had eaten too much ice cream on the boat over and stuff and didn't perform as well as coaches wanted them to. Betty was outstanding. And so she came home feted as America's Golden Girl, and she got ready to train for the 1932 Olympics. And the picture there on the right is Betty probably in about early 1932. Because at the end of 1931, she was in a plane crash, or actually kind of midway through 1931, she was in a plane crash. She was actually left for dead during this plane crash. They found her, they thought she was dead. She was taken to the undertaker. Fortunately, the undertaker noticed her chest moving, and she was discovered to have 2 broken legs, a broken arm. Doctors told her, you'll be lucky to ever walk again, much less run. So let's just get you kind of moving someday, and that'll be all we can dream of. But Betty, again, she wasn't a woman to take no for an answer. And so this photo of her is doing some physical therapy to recover from that injury. And she will come back. She was not done with running. And so she has this amazing comeback as the 1936 Olympics arrive. So she was my first runner I found. And then I found the second one, Louise Stokes, who becomes known as the Malden Meteor. Louise was one of the few, her family, the Stokes were one of the few Black families in this town of Malden, Massachusetts, which is just north of Boston. Louise too was seen as being a very gifted high school athlete. The local track team invited her to come try out with them, and she had always been a runner. She ran everywhere according to her family. And so she too doesn't take no for an answer. She starts running in all these local races. She starts moving her way up the kind of the rungs of how track qualifying races worked. receives an invitation to try out for the 1932 Olympics team. Those trials were in Chicago. So she gets on a train by herself. She travels to Chicago, and she has an amazing performance in Chicago and qualifies for this 1932 Olympic team. So Louise ends up being one of 2 women, Black women, to qualify for this team. And so they are the first Black women to ever qualify for an Olympics team. They travel to Los Angeles because back then the trials kind of went straight into the Olympics. So these women all got on the train in Chicago. They end up traveling cross country, stopping in little towns around the way. I want to remind everyone, this is the Great Depression. This train coming through little towns throughout the country. This was a big, exciting deal for so many sleepy places who were filled with people struggling with hard times. All of these women gave the people of the 1930s so much hope and reason to kind of dream of better times. And so Betty and her teammates head toward Los Angeles. Now, Betty, as I said, Louise, had grown up outside of Boston, which, we've known was an abolitionist hotspot back in the days of the Civil War. It was not bound by many restrictions of the Jim Crow South at the time, but still, Louise knew what it felt like to face discrimination. But this trip to Los Angeles really introduces her to a whole new level of discrimination. And she encounters several experiences along the way, both with her own teammates, with the coaching staff, and then kind of with the media, with a broader world. She and Tidy and these other girls all arrive in Los Angeles. And over time, in these last couple of weeks since the Olympic trials have happened, more and more women, white women, have been added to this Olympic pool. Many of them had coaches who were acting on their behalf, who were loud and arguing on their behalf to get their girls in this pool, even though they hadn't qualified like Louise and Tidy and a few of these other women did. So Louise and Tidy, these 2 Black women, start worrying that their place is not safe because they see that their position is not guaranteed at all, because more and more women are being kind of added to the squad. They see discrimination with their coach. There are all kinds of subtle, what we would call now microaggressions happening at the time with the media. Many times they wouldn't get invited to team photos, just all of these various subtle things happening. So a combination really is affecting them of racism and sexism, because even their male coaches aren't really even taking these women seriously. They were kind of an afterthought in many ways to this Olympic experience. And so Louise and Tidy will both end up being disappointed in Los Angeles. At the last minute, they will see their spots on the relay be given away to other women who did not necessarily qualify for the position. And so I think that these women are so important for us to recognize, all of them, for their trailblazing ways, but especially these women who, very few people have heard of Louise Stokes. As I had been doing my research, I found this sports reporter out of Boston, Massachusetts, who had written, and he's now in Vermont. He had written an article about Louise for the Boston Globe. And I contacted him and I said, where are your sources on Louise? How did you find things? And he ended up being such a lifesaver. He sent me this huge file. He had photographed from microfiche at the Malden Public Library from their old vintage newspapers. And he was so generous. He sent me the folder when I explained my project, what I was working on, and he allowed me to copy it all. And really he saved my eyesight, for one thing. So I didn't have to spend hours going through microfiche. And he really provided me with a glimpse into this woman's life. She was not well documented. He was able to talk to some of her family members at the time, and they all described a Louise coming home from Los Angeles who was really crushed by what had happened there. She never spoke really about the Olympics in Los Angeles. She was so hurt by this. But this is what I find so amazing about her story. She wasn't done. She didn't allow that discrimination to dampen her spirit. And she doubled down, and she decided she was going to try to qualify for these 1936 Olympics coming up in Berlin. So she continues to race and train and prepare for 1936. Alongside our third track star, oh yeah, okay. So this is always, I'd sort of forgotten I'd put this here. This is a photo on the right. You'll see the entire 1932 squad in Los Angeles. And sorry about the flash. You can kind of see there as I was duplicating pictures. But you see Tidy is there in the front row. And then Louise is in that middle row. Well, then this photo on the left, a smaller group. There are a lot of these photos, and they're all they all really don't include Tidy and Louise. And just through tracing these photos and the fact that I went back and found documents of what happened at those 1932 qualifying trials and was able to look at the times and who finished and see that Louise and Tidy had securely won their spots. The fact that then they are pushed out at the last minute is such a tragedy, really. And so moving on to our third athlete, we have Helen Stevens. Helen was the youngest one of these athletes. She was really especially watching what happened in 1932. She had pictures of some of these athletes on her bedroom wall. She grew up in Fulton, Missouri, a real farm girl, with a family struggling with hardships from the 1930s and the Great Depression. Her father was very strict and really had no interest in having a daughter. He was really annoyed not to have more sons to help him with their farm life because he was really too poor to afford all the modern machinery that would have been available to him. And he was really hand farming their place out in Fulton. And so Helen, from a very early age, is receiving a message that she's really not worth anyone's time. And yet she was tall. She had a husky, deep voice. She did not fit in. So well beyond her family, yet amongst her schoolmates, she was really viewed as an outcast. But she also was very gifted athletically. And so for many years, that was just used to kind of, the girls in her school never accepted her. So the only way she kind of achieved any sort of respect was with some of the boys in her small school where she would compete in races with them and contests. And so by the time she reaches high school, she's really pretty bookish, pretty withdrawn. Well, actually, she was kind of always a joker, but she really wasn't ever accepted by her peers. So she was kind of doing her own thing, working on her family farm, and I think really confused about what her future would bring. She'd had several experiences of sexual abuse. She had questions about her own sexuality. So she never felt like she fit in at all. And kind of in an echo to what happened with Betty a few years earlier in 1928, one of the teachers at her school, also the track coach, was at her local church where she was playing in a basketball game. And he was absolutely mesmerized by her athletic ability. He could spot it from a mile away. And so he asked her, hey, get a few of your friends together, a few of the other girls, and let's see if we can time you guys and maybe put together a girls track team. Well, we ends up timing Helen out in back of their local school there in Fulton. Honestly, I think she was wearing like dungarees, her work boots, nothing special, certainly not track shoes. Those would have been too expensive for her at the time. He couldn't even believe his stopwatch when he looked at the time that she ran in this quick sprint. He actually has her do it a few times because he doesn't believe his clock is right. But it was. And so he had stumbled into truly one of the most phenomenal athletes we've really ever seen in this country. Helen had a 9-foot-long stride. And I mean, just think about that for a minute, how long that is when you're right, a 9-foot stride. She was unstoppable. And so while she initially is this real outcast and the town is really uncomfortable with the fact that she's beating these boys in these sort of improv track workouts, suddenly her coach, who really deserves so much credit for seeing her and pulling up, trying to get her more opportunities, he takes her to this AAU race in St. Louis, and she just blows the barn doors off the place. She beat the world record holder at the time, and immediately she becomes this sensation, the Fulton Flash. And so she goes from really being an outcast in Fulton to suddenly Fulton is celebrating Helen Stevens Day, and a booster club miraculously appears, and everyone's determined to get this woman to the 1936 Olympics because everyone at that point now sees something special in her. So these three women, Betty, Louise, and Helen, will all come together to race in Hitler's Olympics. And like so much of what Meg was saying, you know, I didn't really know anything about the boycott movement that took place in the years leading up to these 1936 Olympics. Yes, this photo is great, and I'll talk about this in one sec. But there was this huge, you know, people really could see what was happening in Germany with the rise of the National Socialist Party. They were distrustful of sending some of our own athletes there. And so really all the American diplomats in Berlin were advising FDR not to send an Olympic team. The call to keep these athletes home was very strong, including from places like the NAACP, who didn't want to be seen legitimizing what Hitler was doing in Germany. Yet, over time, some of these athletes started seeing an opportunity, not only to show Hitler what they were capable of, but also their own country. And this photo, I think, is so important. 18 Black athletes ended up traveling to Berlin to compete in the Olympics. And America won those Olympics largely from the points that this group, out of this couple hundred Olympians who went, these 18 athletes accrued half the points that ended up winning that Olympics. And really, the only Black Olympian we know from that era is Jesse Owens. I mean, really, the newspapers kind of all piled on Jesse, and he was an amazing athlete. He won 4 gold medals in Berlin, but there were 18 others who were all accomplishing amazing things as well. We have Tidy kind of there in the middle. She finally gets to race. She gets her big opportunity in Berlin, and she becomes the first Black woman to compete in the Olympics for the Americans. But there really was so much controversy around these Olympics. And these athletes all felt kind of a special burden to really show the country and the world what they could do. Many of these men would come home to compete for their schools as track stars. Even with Olympic medals, they were not allowed to travel to certain meets. They were not allowed to compete in certain collegiate races because of Jim Crow laws. And I also want to point out, a lot of these athletes also then go on to have amazing careers in politics, in science, and that's Mac Robinson over there on the far right. That is Jesse Robinson's older brother. So we can see talent runs in the families of these really high achieving people who did not allow themselves to take no for an answer, even though they were under so much pressure to back off and to kind of give up their dreams, to defer those dreams for years to come. This is a group of real trailblazers who I think has been overlooked. And it's really interesting when we think about these Olympics. They did end up happening. FDR was insistent. The boycott movement was not successful, although it only failed gaining enough votes. It only failed by a couple of votes. But this group of athletes really showed everyone what they were capable of doing. And I just love this picture. It just speaks volumes about really all that these athletes were capable of, the men, the women, these athletes of color. So many boundaries were broken during these games. And it is interesting to think, if that boycott movement hadn't happened, if it had happened, if 1936 hadn't occurred, at the same time, would life have been different? Would Hitler have lost his platform? This was such an important game for him, such an important show for him to really open up what he wanted to show the world. This was a real propaganda masterpiece for him. So there's a lot of tension within these games over participation, accomplishment, and identity. It's just, to me, it's fascinating on so many levels, from the sports, the politics, and all of the social movements underway. Because I think when we think about a great sports story, it's often just a mirror for what's happening in larger society. And so that's what really has captivated me and made this story such an adventure from my own perspective. Oh yes, and here we are. Here are our women, these 1936 Olympians who traveled to Berlin. This is when they're aboard the ship. We can see Louise is there in the back row with Betty right next to her. Dee Beckman was the first woman track coach. She is there next to Betty. And then Helen is in that middle row, really the tallest one in there. But these women all went, they were really, as I said, kind of afterthoughts. Many of them, most of them, had to pay their own way. When they all got to New York to get on the boat, the IOC, or the American Olympic Committee, announced to them that they were only going to pay for a couple of them to go, including Helen and Tidy. The rest of them all had to raise $500 to win, to get their passage to Berlin. And so there were a lot of frantic telegrams and phone calls home. A lot of churches came to the rescue of raising money, a lot of families and a lot of communities to get these women to Berlin.
Wow. Yeah, you got everything I was going to ask you about. You perfectly summed up. I was going to mention, you said it's a greater view of like what's going on in the culture or in America at the time, but like what would it look like just physically going to the Olympics compared to like the Olympics that would have happened this year?
Well, that is such a good question, because I hadn't realized until I started working on this book how much these 1936 Olympics really shape what we know of modern Olympics. Hitler, all of his efforts into pomp and circumstance all manifest here in these Olympics. The torch run is a completely Nazi manifestation of like trying to show Aryan superiority. Opening ceremonies had always occurred, but Hitler really, he created this movie that he had Leni Riefenstahl make. I mean, so much of what we identify with these Olympics really date back to this. A couple things also from a few of these other Olympics, including the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles here, are what gave us what we now know as the Olympic Village. Los Angeles created all of these bungalows out in the Baldwin Hills for the men to stay in. So it was really the Great Depression kind of played into the creation of the Olympic Village. So this is a really formative time for the Olympics. So, I mean, it just would have looked really different as far as like the athletes. I mean, today winning a medal or just going comes down to, really technology and the finest bits of sort of athletic tuning. Well, back then, a lot of these athletes had flasks in their bags. They were smoking during their breaks when they weren't running. It was a different world. They were eating a ton of ice cream. If you've read Unbroken, we know Louis Zamperini was like eating his own body weight on the ship over to Berlin every day. So it was a really different world. Athletes didn't have the long history in training that athletes do now. I mean, the heartbreaking thing about these games being canceled at the moment, or postponed, I should say, is that these Olympians, many of them have been training since they were 4 and 5 and 6. I mean, it's just a very different ball game from back in this era when many of these athletes had sort of picked up some of these sports in recent years and then find themselves already as Olympians. It's pretty amazing.
They were, now they're more of like public figures. So they have social media and you're watching every minute, whereas maybe it was a little delayed because they would be famous when they came back instead.
Yeah, and really that fame was so limited too. I mean, and there were no sponsorships and all this. So, I mean, it really was it really favored a certain class of person for the most part, which is what made so many of these women competing in track and field notable. Most of them did not come from wealthy backgrounds at all. In fact, I'm not sure any did. I mean, they really had to scramble to make their way to Berlin. And, I mean, I always think of sort of the Wheaties box as being the really iconic thing that honor you receive, like Mary Lou Retton and all these things. Well, later in Betty Robinson's life, one day she was pouring a box of cereal into a cereal bowl and like a little card fell out, how they do in cereal boxes. And it was called Sports Oddities, and it was her. She was the sports oddity for running in her way into the Olympics. So, I mean, times have changed a lot, but then I think if there's one thing we saw in Rio, there's a lot of room still to change. The way the press talks about women athletes, there is still, I wrote a lot of newspapers that make their way into this story. I recreate because the tone, the way reporters talked about the buxom gal in lane 3. I mean, it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around now. Yet, I mean, everyone is still obsessed with Serena Williams' comeback after having a baby. I mean, we still have progress to make in some of these areas. There are still an unequal number of events in the Olympics for women that there are for men. So there still could be more women in the leadership role for the IOC. So there's still definitely room for a lot of advancement for women.
Right. You said that they don't want to see like tired women. I'm like, I bet they were tired of hearing that.
I know. In fact, these 1928 Olympics are amazing in Amsterdam because women were running the 800 and stuff, and they looked so tired at the end. They pulled all these distance races after 1928, and they don't return again until like the late 60s because who wanted to see a tired looking woman? That was actually what reporters said. They're like, nothing about this is a winning situation. None of us want to have tired looking women in our newspapers. So
there's a lot of love, and a lot of people are excited to read or have read and learn just stuff they didn't know. I wanted to point out before you came on the podcast and talked to your editor, Lucia.
That was so fun.
We love, and I have a picture for everybody to see. So you can go on our podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, Library Locals podcast, and hear a really great conversation. I think even just between editor and author and how you guys formulated everything, but also you talk about your other books. I think that's really interesting as well. So much more if you want to learn all about this book and many more, go listen to
it.
Right.
And I should also, I should also point out that I'll have on the 7th, the day the book comes out, I'll be doing a launch event. I'm not sure the link has made it in yet, but people can register for that. I'll be playing Olympic trivia, an Olympic history trivia game with some other authors like Kate Quinn, Jennifer Robson, and I'll also be talking to Betty Robinson's daughter and granddaughter during that. So please, people register. It'll be a lot of fun, a fun hour. And I'm just so grateful to you both for having me on to talk. Thank you.
Always fun. And we have a link also for your list of books that people can dive into on Friday 29. So we'll link to both of those things so they can get a list.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know I'm trying to give people like reading marathons or like Olympic readings so that we can all kind of get that vibe this summer and kind of keep our, the agony of defeat and the ecstasy of victory, all of that keep going. It's really, the Olympics hold a really dear place in my heart. For many years, I had my own fantasies about being an Olympian. I was a figure skater as a kid. And I mean, I've pictured myself pretty much trying to win a gold medal in every sport. And I would like to propose a few new sports.
There's not enough.
Never enough. Never enough.
Our friend Wendy Wilson Bartlett, who is with the Cuyahoga County Library System, says there will be a lot of Olympic nostalgia this year. She does collection development for them. So you're right on. I think people will just be really nostalgic. They'll be looking for it. So this is for them. So,
good,
and for everyone watching, we did share the registration link for Elise's launch event in the comments. So be sure to run, not walk, to register for that. And let's bring Meg back on so we can kind of round everything out, because this was such an incredible look at a period of history that you would think has been discovered, that there aren't secrets and untold stories, but it's amazing what can unveil itself through tireless research and work and storytelling on your part. So let's bring Meg back on.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome back, Meg.
Very nice. It was really interesting, Elise.
Oh, thank you.
Quite fun to see.
Yeah, I love that our books are from this very similar period, and I think they really do work well together, setting the stage of what was happening during this period.
Yeah, I do think, there's a lot of appetite for extraordinary women in history who've been forgotten, being rediscovered, and I think both of us are in that vein. So I'm
Yes.
quite looking forward to reading yours. I'm hoping somebody
Oh,
from HarperCollins will slip me an early
yeah.
copy.
I will make sure we get you a copy, Meg. Thank you.
Yeah, and speaking of book clubs, I do think this is a fantastic book. Both books are just perfect book club reads. So if anyone watching has questions about how they can either get a sample copy or how we can help integrate these two books into your book club circulation, let us know. We're here to help. But yeah, again, I just want to thank you both for coming on and sharing the story behind the story and just whetting people's appetites for these incredible books. Again, Meg, your book is on sale today in paperback.
Yes.
And then Elise, your book is on sale July 7th.
Yes.
So not that far away.
No.
No.
Long weekend to read too.
Yes, yes. So before we sign off, is there anything else we want to say?
Yes, thank you so much, Chris and Lainey, for organizing this. Thanks, Elise, for sharing the stage with me. And thanks to everybody who's listening and all the librarians out there keeping good books in people's hands in this time. We all need more reading.
Absolutely.
Well,
inspiration. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Again, historical fiction is such a high demand topic for libraries and readers in general. So I know there are a lot of people who absolutely adored and appreciated this session today. So much more to come. And just for those of you watching, please do join us on Thursday. We'll be having a very special Facebook Live. Let's see here. And we have a Facebook takeover or an Instagram takeover tomorrow, right, Lainey?
We do, and I have a image. Very excited. The Amistad team is taking over our Instagram all day tomorrow, so you can learn all about their new books or ones they've put out, and you get to know the team a little. So Harper Library on Instagram, and follow along.
And then on Thursday, we'll have Alice Randall, author of Black Bottom Saints, in conversation with her editor. So that's Thursday at 2 p.m. So that's a can't miss episode as well. And I think with that, that's everything we have. Again, purchase links for both of these fantastic books are in the comments and in the video description of our episode. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and we'll get to them. But again, thank you so much, Elise. Thank you so much, Meg. This is really fascinating. And we hope to see you in real life soon, as soon as possible.
You as
Take
well.
good care.
Yeah.